Let's get talking. Nigeria's inflation rose to 15.92% in March 2022, following a similar uptick recorded in the previous month as a result of increase in energy prices, representing the highest rate recorded since October 2021. Well, according to the recently released Consumer Price Index by the National Bureau of Statistics, the 0.22 uptick, that's percent uptick, has been attributed majorly to spike in the composite food index, which rose to 17.20% in March. A sharp increase in the price of cooking gas, as well as hike in energy costs. Similarly, urban inflation rate increased to 16.44% year-on-year in March 2022, showing a decline of 2.32 percentage points from the rate recorded in March 2021. Which was 18.76%, while the rural inflation rose to 15.42% in March, with a decrease of 2.18% from 17.60% recorded in March 2022. Yes, a lot of figures to bundle with here, but I'm going to be doing this with the Director of Research and Strategy at Chapel Hill, Denham, Mr. Tajuddin Ibrahim. Thank you so much, Mr. Ibrahim. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much as well for having me on.
Yes, Nigeria's inflation rises further to 5 months high, standing at 15.92% in March 2022. What were your projections? Was this what you were expecting? And what are the fundamentals responsible for this?
So, thank you very much. The number that came out of the MBS was largely in line with what we were expecting. We were actually expecting the impact of the shortage in the supply of PMS in the country to, largely speaking, impact inflation in the month of March. And the number has come out and indicates that we actually called it right. We already believed that in the month of February, the inflation number that we saw at that point in time was not fully reflecting the impact of the shortage in the supply of petrol to the huge population of this country. So the March number is a reflection of what really was happening in terms of the shortage of petrol supply, and also the increases that we saw in the prices of gas due to local supply issues that came on the back of global disruptions to supplies, given the war between Russia and Ukraine. So, in summary, the number came in line as we expected.
The increase in energy prices, of course, is something that we can't ignore. Fertilizer, yes, alluding to what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. All of this put together is also affecting inflation figures. Do you think that the MPC will be thinking of rejigging or, doing something with regards to the figures that we've been on for months, talking about shaping the decision of the next MPC meeting? Do you think this would affect anything?
I think it is possible, because if we look at the voting pattern the last time that the Monetary Policy Committee of the Central Bank met, the voting pattern indicated that 40% of the members of the committee were already voting for an increase in the policy rate. So when we now see higher inflation, just like the one that has been reported, there are higher chances that when they meet next month, in the month of May, they most likely are going to consider, increasing interest rates. And we are going to probably have, more of them voting in favor of an interest rate increase. So, but the question, to my mind is that if we increase interest rates, does that necessarily bring down inflation? That is one key question. The second thing to my mind also is the impact that will have on the borrowing cost of the government, because the moment you raise interest rates, what you are calling for is for the government to go to the financial market and borrow at a higher interest rates. So the central bank, in my mind, would have to consider all these options. It is not a straitjacket, in my opinion.
Let's talk about food inflation here, and we see it rising to 17.2% in the review month, an uptick to the 17.1% recorded in the preceding month. What could be responsible for this? I know insecurity and all of that is still impacting price of foodstuff.
I think for the food inflation, there are two key elements in my mind. The first element is around output. It is likely that we did not have enough output that could have resulted in higher harvest. The second element to my mind is supply, in terms of the supply chain, by moving the food that were produced to the market and also finally to the consumers. So I think those two key factors were responsible. And in my mind, I see security on the center stage in this regard, because in terms of output, farmers wouldn't be able to produce as much if they perceive insecurity. In terms of supply chain, transporting the food produced in the farms to the market will be challenging also if security is a threat to those that are going to supply or transport the food to the market. So I see these two factors as the driver of the higher food inflation that we saw in the month of March. And more importantly, my sense is that the uptick that we saw in the month of March is an early sign of what we may see in the coming months in terms of food inflation, and it indicates that the government should do the necessary things, take the necessary steps to ensure that we have increase in output, we have increase in supply, so that in the coming months those numbers will not be as bad as we currently have them, or they will not go to a worse level. We have seen 17.2. We can easily see 17.5 in the next 1 to 2 months if we do not take the necessary steps.
I'm staying partly now with agriculture because, of course, we must eat, and that's very important. Sometime last week, the federal government ordered the release of grains, to cushion the effect of all of this that we see, and coupled with, of course, notably the effort by the Central Bank of Nigeria in the agricultural space. I know you're monitoring all of this. Are you saying that we are still in the transition period, or are we reaping all of the gains of these efforts being made on both sides?
So I think largely speaking, let us speak first about the CBN's efforts. It is commendable, but my sense is that the CBN still needs to do more. And if you look at the communique of the Monetary Policy Committee meeting, the CBN, it is in there that the CBN, is encouraged to do more in terms of supporting the agri sector. So we are still in this transition stage on that front, and it is likely that the country will reap the fruits of that effort in due course. But in terms of the supply that the government is looking at around 40,000 tons of grain from our reserves, that number is extremely small. We are talking about 40,000 in a metric ton. We commend them, but I think it is small in a country where we consume millions of tons in terms of major grains like wheat, for instance, or let me talk about rice or any other major grain that we consume in this country. We consume them in millions of tons, not in thousands of tons. So the supply that we're expecting on that front is not going to be enough. We still need more to ensure that supply exceed or at least meet up with demand so that price increases will moderate in the next coming quarters.
Some analysts will argue that we have imported inflation. Even in the United States, it's on 8.5%, highest in recent times. What do you think will be happening to poor and underdeveloped countries or developing countries like Nigeria, considering all of the issues now globally and, of course, domestically as we move on ahead of the election year?
So what most likely is going to happen is, developing countries such as Nigeria would have to see, higher imported inflation, most likely, because number one, the external environment, or let me say the countries where we import from, most of them have increased interest rates, which means they now have much stronger currencies compared to Nigeria, compared to our naira here. So we most likely are going to see pressure on the foreign exchange front, and that implies higher imported inflation for us in this country. So what we should do, in my view, is we should consider consuming locally made goods and services. By the time we look inward and consume more of locally made goods and services, then we will see little impact of what is happening externally on our own economy. But if we continue to increase our demand, taking it externally, we are going to see higher imported inflation, and that in itself will also result in the elevation of the overall inflation of the country as a whole, in my view.
Brilliant stuff there. Now, the World Bank, of course, IMF, we can't rule out their suggestions and comments because, of course, we need to take them seriously. And they are now saying that countries like Nigeria need to adjust policies to increase supply and all of this. I don't know how this comes to you, but I'm looking at it now. In what way are we looking at trade policies or general economic policies? What do you think really needs to be done? Inclusive growth is what we are talking about.
Well, I think, general economic, policy is what, can sort of, help us in this matter. And I think, there are, plans in the pipeline by the government to ensure that infrastructure, for instance, is one thing that, we solve as a problem. The moment we solve that, we should see, some progress in terms of, how our economy is positively impacted. In the short term, we are going to see challenges because government revenue is not going to be enough, to finance the budget. But in the medium to long term, if we get infrastructure, for instance, right, it will go a long way in alleviating, some of the issues or problems that we have in this country, because naturally you are going to see an increase in the activities of youths because we have the right infrastructure, and their activities are going to feed into the overall economy in terms of growth, in terms of development, in terms of impact. So we need to get infrastructure right, in my own view. We need to borrow, but we should borrow to fix our infrastructure problem for long-term benefit and growth and development of the economy as a whole. That's my view.
Interesting one. Let's talk about states before we wrap up. I'm looking at the state with the highest inflation rate for the month of March. We have like of Cross River, 18.42%, followed by Kogi, 18.18%, and Gombe with 18.09%. I'm looking at these states. Any strategic way of addressing this ugly trend?
One way we could, address that trend is to ensure that output in each of those states is much higher in the coming months. So it could be seasonal in the sense that we have, food prices in those areas or states going higher because of low harvest. So by the time we have higher harvest of food, we should see, their inflation numbers, coming down. And that still comes back to, looking inward to ensure that we produce more in terms of food, to ensure that we patronize more of domestic products, instead of looking outside of our own economy. So I think, but in the next couple of months, those numbers can come down by the time we have higher production of food products, or let me say also higher harvest, particularly when we get into the rainy season proper, in my view.
Finally, before I let you go, Mr. Ibrahim, I'm thinking that we were talking about domesticating, promoting local content. I also think that there needs to be an orientation around that. We need to understand this so that we take it hook, line, and sinker. Because many Nigerians, on an average Nigerian, believes in something imported. That's on one side. Then on the other side, what's your projection moving on? Are we likely to see this increase going on as we move to 2023?
So as we move into 2023, it is likely that we see inflation, touch around 16% if this trend, persists. But what could actually make us not to say, that much a high number is if we have increase in the output of food. And I continue to say food because if you talk about inflation in Nigeria, food inflation and the headline inflation, there is a 98% correlation between those two indices. So if we get food right, we get our headline inflation right. The second thing around, sensitization of, the public around demanding, for, locally produced products, I think it is good. But what I think everybody wants to see are the infrastructure that we need to get things in place, to get things moving on. Let me give you an instance. A youth that has a small barbing shop or a small barbing salon wants to get power at a relatively cheaper cost than what he already currently spends on power. So if we have all those things fixed, like fixing power, and fixing some other infrastructure, we are going to get somewhere in terms of how we want people to demand for locally made goods and services. But if we do not do that, no matter how much you tell people or discourage them, they will still go abroad. And going abroad is not the best for us in the current season, in my own opinion.
Amos, thank you so much. Brilliant conversation there. I've been speaking to the Director of Research and Strategy at Chapel Hill, Denham, Mr. Tajuddin Ibrahim. Do enjoy the rest of your day.
You too.